Good evening, dear friends. This is Max Satmermanov with SRC Motors. Today, I'd like to talk to you about the topic of choosing a chassis in karting. It's actually a very important topic. In my opinion, many people might not pay enough attention to it. Or even if they do pay enough attention, maybe it's not entirely conscious or not based on the criteria that, in my opinion, they should be using. And that's why, today I'd like to share my perspective with you on just how important the chassis is when it comes to a driver going really fast on the track. That's it. Of course, whether you're already involved in karting or just thinking about getting started, whether you see it as a hobby or want to take it seriously and go professional, when you look at karting as a sport, the first thing that catches your eye is the flashy side of the machine. It's what we see on the outside, the driver sitting there in a cool helmet, in the kart, and the kart itself is bright and eye-catching. And for many people, even at this stage, they start to form likes or dislikes, sometimes just based on how it looks. Of course, the kart, the fundamental chassis of the kart, is the primary and most crucial supporting part, and in my considered opinion, its profound importance for the driver's overall speed and performance is much greater than, say, the engine's contribution. Because a lot of people think, the engine, the power unit, that's what gives you the power to come in first, to overtake everyone, to be the fastest of the fast. That's it. But, the thing is, our engines are actually all more or less the same, So, there's the saying, right? The engine gives you a speed boost measured in tenths, maybe hundredths of a second. But it's the chassis that gives you whole seconds. The chassis finds you those seconds, and that's a really important aspect I want to focus on. And here, well, as is customary, I would probably like to thoroughly run through some, essential aspects, some distinct subsections, and meticulously tell you about each and every one of them, precisely what a chassis is, exactly how to choose it, what crucial details you truly need to pay close attention to, or perhaps, what you absolutely do not need to pay any attention to at all. So, well, let's go. What can I say? Let's start with the fact that the first criterion, when a driver enters a discipline like karting, or is thinking about it, or has already entered and taken some first steps in this discipline, he pays attention and gets some offers, from guys who have been doing this for a long time. You can buy this kind of kart, or that one, or another one. There's a whole set of offers, so to speak. It's very important to make the right choice in this area. Why? Because you don't want to make a mistake. And here, everyone faces a big, fundamental decision about what they're going to choose for themselves. Are they going to get a used kart or a new one? This approach, I'd actually declare this criterion right from the start, really highlight it, and honestly, I'd emphasize it again at the end. Why? I'll explain why later. You'll understand soon enough. So, that's an important point. So, if for some reason, mostly financial, the driver isn't able to buy a new kart yet, or they're just following the usual practice, I'll try it out, see what it's like for me, and if everything goes well, I'll keep going. Yeah, that's a common approach, happens all the time. Of course, there's a certain logic to that too. You don't want to overpay for a new kart right away, but there are risks involved. How can you avoid risks? They're always there. There's a risk you might end up with a product that's not really high quality. Maybe the product isn't quite right for you, or maybe it's just not up to date anymore. And you might end up a bit disappointed, yeah? Well, I hope that this won't happen to you. But still, I'd like to point out a few things here, okay? First of all, you really need to set your emotions aside, right? By emotional part, I mean what I mentioned earlier, the way the chassis looks, how flashy it appears. All of that, the fairings, the stickers, that's all extremely secondary. It doesn't affect the driver's speed at all. So here, you really need to set your emotions aside, because a driver, or a future driver, who's looking at the chassis they like always feels like it's faster, that it's really cool, but something is holding them back from being number one. But they think, once they get everything, they'll be off and running. They're trying to calm themselves down and psych themselves up, mentally and emotionally. You need to move away from that. That is, you need to look at it like, actually, I would start thinking about it from the perspective of going from the big picture to the details, right? Everyone knows there are world championships, and there's the very popular WSK championship, right? WSK. Honestly, I would start looking from there. Who's leading? Who's at the top? Which teams? But let me clarify right away, that's not the only indicator. A lot of people who know this business might start criticizing me, but no, it's not the main indicator. It's just one of the indicators. Still, that's where I would start, no matter what, right? And I would analyze and look at which chassis, which manufacturers are actually making it to the top. As for the WSK and the World Championship, you can analyze information over a very long period. That is, you can look at data from 1, 2, 3, even 4 years. And if you have a certain persistence and an analytical mindset, of course, you'll look at and analyze those brands that are consistently at the front. So that's the first point. Those who win, that's one thing. And then there are the brands that have a very high density of presence in the top 10, top 5, top 15, depending on what result and what statistical parameters you've set. So if the chassis you're looking at is used by a factory team, that's one. And then there are wealthy, independent non-factory teams who are very meticulous about their choice of chassis and always pick only what is truly fast at the moment. So what we're saying is that there's a factory team represented, and it's also used by some other private teams. It's the same chassis, right? And the concentration of drivers, let's say, at least in the top 10, is about 20 to 30%. So it's not like there are just 5 or 6 drivers from the whole grid participating. One is leading thanks to his own personal qualities, maybe something really extraordinary, and the rest are all in the second or third 10. Yeah, that's definitely not ideal. So in this case, I would focus on analyzing the density at the front. So if both the first and second drivers, let's say, I don't know, there are 3 people in the top 10, and in the top 15 there are already 5 or 6 people, right? That shows a more or less stable result that these drivers are performing. Yeah, I wouldn't consider these competitions as the main priority when choosing a chassis. Why? Because, well, first of all, it's the World Championship. It's a battle between manufacturers, a battle of top drivers. And it's not entirely indicative, because there they work extremely hard, invest all the money from the engine manufacturing industry, and they race on completely different tires, possibly unlike yours, and on a completely different surface, because the tracks where these kinds of championships are held are very well broken in, heavily rubbered, and the engineers find ways to set up and use the cars, meaning to give them the ability to go very fast specifically in these conditions. It's possible that such conditions won't exist in your country. In ours, at least in Kazakhstan, we definitely don't have that kind of grip, and let's say, such conditions or even that kind of tire might simply not be available. If, say, the World Championship is running on Vega tires, and you have Vega, great, that's already one parameter that matches. They're racing. Well, if they're racing on white Vega tires, for example, and you're on XM, or you're on green XH, then that's already a big difference, right? So one chassis might work great on white tires and maybe a bit worse on green ones, right? I mean, of course, it's all a matter of setup, but still, the orientation there is a slightly different aspect. These are the subtleties you need to keep in mind with this approach. Excellent. We've figured it out. We've talked about how you analyze the entire World Championship. People are driving consistently, closely packed together, like, for example, the CRG team. They haven't been at the top here for a long time, unfortunately, right? On the world stage, even though they used to hold the very best positions about 10 years ago, with drivers like Jonathan Donan, David Afor, Max Verstappen, these are all the names that made CRG what it is, and Paulo Di Canto, who was probably the last driver to win the World Championship, the World Cup, drove incredibly fast, but then his results started to decline, and he left karting altogether. But in the last races, for the past 5 or 6 years, they've been trying to get back to the top. Giancarlo Tinani has been doing a lot of work, but in the last race, well, not the last one, sorry, about 3 or 4 races ago, you might remember that in the top 12, there were 9 CRG karts. That's an incredible result, 9 karts. Yeah, and what's more, the CRG wasn't even first. It was second, then third, fifth, seventh, eighth, and the further down you went, the more packed it got. And they didn't all finish with that kind of density, of course. 2 or 3 people dropped out along the way, but the density speaks for itself. Still, in the next race, that kind of density wasn't there anymore. And on another track, a race later, it wasn't there either. Yeah, by the way, that's another thing I definitely want to see, to have this happen on fundamentally different tracks. So, we all know, some of us have raced, some haven't, but there are some really fast, sweeping tracks, like Sarno in southern Italy, for example, or, say, the very technical, twisty track in Lanado. So if drivers from the same team, for example, manage to win just as successfully on both a twisty track and a fast track, that says a lot as well. The car is versatile. It can perform in any conditions. Alright, let's move on. What else? What else are we talking about? We're talking about the fact that, after analyzing the World Championship and some top-level disciplines and competitions, you can move closer to your own region. In our case, I would talk about the Russian Championship, for example, right? Yeah, the conditions are a bit different there too. Yeah, there's more grip there, the tracks are different, but at least you'll have a lot more analytics. There will already be much more. Why? Because it's a Russian-speaking environment, with lots of acquaintances and friends. Ask the people you trust for their opinions on the aspects that matter to you, and after some time, you make a decision. Is this car even capable of performing in your conditions? This is all just theory right now. We're still just discussing the introductory part, so to speak, the initial stage where you're studying the issue, assuming you're a meticulous person and want to spend your money not in vain, but to get the most benefit for yourself, right? And here, of course, you need to take into account certain aspects as well, right? That is, specifically analyzing the chassis. Let's say you've made your choice. You watched the World Championship, you picked Russia, and then you chose your specific region, right? So if in your region this chassis is fast, and there are a lot of them running closely together under the same principles, right? Then, in principle, you can reasonably assume that if you buy the same chassis, you'll also be able to go pretty fast. There's a chance, but after that, it all depends on your driving skills. So, what would I pay attention to, for example, when choosing a chassis? First of all, which tubing works best in your region, right? For example, is it 32mm or 30mm? Or maybe some combination of 30 and 32mm tubing? This makes a huge difference. They behave differently. Yes, of course, experienced engineers can tune both types. With a certain degree of probability, the 32mm will go fast too, sorry. And so will the 30mm. But the handling and the feel for the pilot will be completely different. Even if they show the same lap times, the sensations for the pilot will be different. And at the same time, the 32mm tube might be heavier, while the 30mm is lighter. So the first aspect is still the weight, because some chassis brands are on the heavier side. They can weigh, when fully equipped, 105, 104, 103, or 102 kilograms. Others are lighter. They can weigh 86, 85, somewhere in that range. If you're a heavier person, a pilot, then I would recommend looking towards the lighter chassis, these ones. Sorry, not 85, of course. I meant 95, 96. The thing is, the pilot. Actually, I'm talking about the KZ class right now. I just automatically got into this topic. But those in the know probably already guessed what I'm talking about. So, I'll be talking about the KZ class, where the situation is more or less clear. This is our top class, and I've been participating in it for a long time. It would probably make more sense to me, and maybe to someone else as well. So anyway. As for weight, that's a sore subject for me personally. I'm always racing overweight. Overweight compared to 175 kilograms. That's the minimum weight that the car, together with the driver and their gear, should weigh. So, those 175 kilograms, at best, there were times when I was right on the mark, but mostly I'm 5, 10, 15 kilograms over. That's a lot. The car isn't powerful enough to just ignore that extra weight. And of course, this affects everything. The centrifugal force during the race, when taking corners, the car's ability to accelerate, the load on the tires, and so on, and so on, and so on. Right. That's why it's always best to keep the weight to a minimum here. If, in any case, you still have excess weight even on the lightest car, there are a couple of tools, like carbon floor mats, magnesium wheels and other components, hubs, carbon mounts, exhaust noise dampers, some other accessories, or you can use a smaller radiator. But all of that together only gives you maybe 1.5, 2 kilograms at most. So it's really that close to the limit. But sorry! An excess weight of 10 kilograms, say, from 175 to 185, already gives you a handicap of almost half a second. So, under otherwise equal conditions, if you're 10 kilograms heavier, you lose about half a second. That's a lot if you plan to compete and race with the top guys within the same 10th, 100th, or 1000th of a second. If you manage to keep up with them within those thousandths, just imagine how much better you could do if you weighed the same, 175 or 176 kilograms. So yeah, that's that. The question of weight is, of course, very important. Ceramic brakes used to be relevant before. Now they're banned, but they also significantly reduced weight. So we've looked at the technical aspect, right? Basically, just analytically, who is going fast? We've looked at the weight aspect, worked through it, and realize that, let's say, you theoretically fit into this, right? Another big aspect I would emphasize when talking to the guys using this chassis is, of course, the brakes. Everyone has different brakes. I mean, before they were kind of, more or less standardized, right? Like V05, V06, those series were installed on a huge number of kart manufacturers, and it was kind of easy, clear, and accessible to everyone. So, you get into one kart, another, a third one, and but the brakes and chassis from OTK always stood apart. Now, almost everyone has different, unique brakes, right? And the brakes are exactly the component I would pay a lot of attention to, of course, after I figure out everything else, right? And I'll also take into account for myself, like the chassis configuration, how it drives and handles on the track. That's probably the number one question. The second most important thing is the brakes. That is, how effective they are. There are, after all, some brakes that, no matter how much they require very careful and meticulous maintenance every single time. So, there are brakes that literally need to be serviced after every race. You have to drain everything, bleed them, they get air in the system. Everything starts working inconsistently. Sometimes one caliper grabs earlier, sometimes another later, and of course, all of this immediately affects the quality of your driving. Your balance is constantly changing. And here, I would actually talk to people who are already using them. If there aren't any widespread complaints about them, I would probably consider them. Yes, brakes do need to be serviced. That doesn't mean you can't, or shouldn't, service them. Of course, you need to service them at certain intervals. Before a race, it's best to refresh everything. The brake pads, bleed the brakes again, get everything ready, make sure the pads aren't rubbing or dragging when the wheels spin freely, and check the brake disc. Otherwise, it'll overheat, performance will drop, it'll wear out faster, and from the heat, your brake fluid can start to boil. Basically, there are a ton of negative consequences that all pile up on each other. So, the first thing I'd look at is how suitable they are, or how easy they are to maintain. The second thing is how well they work for your riding style. Of course, that's not something you can figure out right away, right? There are brakes that, with just a light touch, grab instantly, and you get that progressive braking feel. At some point, you keep pressing and pressing, and then they start to lock up, but you don't really understand why, right? So, it's like you press just a little and they brake really hard. Then I keep pressing and pressing, and suddenly, bam, they grab all at once. So, a progressive characteristic. That's a really important point, that you feel this progressive, increase in braking force. In other words, the more you press, the stronger the force, and that's how it should work.
Why?
Why is this so important? Because it's really important, when you're going through a turn. So, I'll cover this topic separately, probably. Actually, not probably. When I talk about piloting, about the basics of piloting, I'll go into a lot of detail about braking. Because in my opinion, braking, the whole secret to a pilot's speed isn't in how they accelerate, as it might seem at first glance, but in how they brake, how they enter a turn, and how much speed and stability they carry into the corner. And this is where the brakes are really important, right? So, the so-called trail braking. Many of you have probably heard of it. If not, Google it and check it out. It's a very important aspect of how you drive on the track, how you enter a corner, and at what speed you go through it. So, there's also this thing, brakes, right? So maybe there's some kind of universality here, and overall, the repairability of the chassis, right? You should always keep this aspect in mind as well. Why? Because if you buy some unique chassis that no one else has, you'll immediately run into the issue that you have to keep some spare parts on hand, original parts that only you will have. And when you sell it, you'll have to pass on this whole set like a travel kit to the next owner. Maybe you'll never need them, but you'll end up hauling around the huge stock of spare parts. Axles, rods, brake pads, some other solutions, hubs and so on and so forth, wheels that are specific to your needs. So you'll have to keep the set on hand. And here, let me give you an example, okay? There are some chassis where pretty much everything is interchangeable. Well, actually, everything is interchangeable, but there are some very unique brands, like Sodi, for example. It's made in France, unlike about 90 or 95% of all chassis in the world, which are made in Italy. Sodi is another very serious, major, and well-known brand. There are a couple of brands in Germany, in China of course, in Australia, like Aero, and so on and so forth. But the main 90% are still made in Italy. And there, of course, technological progress is really moving forward. Well, maybe scientific and technological progress is a bit of an overstatement, But all the engineering is focused on constantly improving and developing this particular field. Racing, tracks, teams, the work. And by being involved in this all the time, you keep accelerating, and improving everything. So, these are basically the main points that, after analyzing them theoretically, you start somehow moving on to the practical part. Now, where should you make your choice? And also, of course, well, let's say you've already decided, right? That you're going with a certain car, a certain brand. Sorry, excuse me. You pick a certain brand, that's it, you've made your choice. If I were you, I would also look into some details, like for example, the seat position, right? Based on the experience of those guys you trust, whose opinions you value, right? If you're big, tall, you look at, so the seat directly affects the balance of the car. And in my opinion, when it comes to seat positioning, that's the number one thing that sets the whole handling balance of the car cart. Usually, the manufacturer gives a certain range, plus or minus 3 or 4 centimeters, depending on how tall the driver is or not. That's it. The seat is installed, and everything else is built around that. Unfortunately, many people don't understand this. They think that if they're a bit shorter and the steering wheel is far away, they'll just move the seat forward, and that'll bring them closer to the pedals and the steering wheel. And here's where the worst thing actually happens. The car's balance changes so much, it shifts to the front end steers beautifully, but you have absolutely no rear grip, right? And this too, leads to problems. You brake poorly, you can't enter the turn well, you can't go in fast because there's no grip at the rear. The front end turns in beautifully, you get what's called oversteer, but there's absolutely no rear end. So this balance again, right? And again, in Italy for example, it will be one way, on grippy tracks that are rubbered in. On a track somewhere that doesn't have that kind of grip, it'll be different. But this balance, you have to find it. If you're tall, you move along this range toward the edge, let's say, to the farthest point, to some limit. If you're shorter, it's closer. But remember, the seat is installed as it should be, and everything else is built around the seat. If you don't have enough length to reach the pedals, if your legs can't reach the pedals, you move the pedals closer to you. If the standard adjustments aren't enough, you get a special package that lets you move them even closer. But under no circumstances, not a single centimeter, not a single millimeter, should you move the seat forward. The steering wheel, you pull it toward you as much as possible, and if that's not enough, you extend it with the hub. So it's clear, right? That's the whole point, right? Basically, you set everything up around the seat. Why? Because the balance of the cart starts right here. Then you start to understand which chassis, which setups you're roughly using, and what range they move, in terms of axle stiffness. That's also one of the main, axes. It's the main parameter that's always taken into account. Why is that? Some chassis prefer soft, some medium. Some are more medium stiff, medium. It all depends on how that chassis behaves on a particular surface. Of course, when you arrive at big races, you show up on the first day and the surface is one way. 2 days later, depending on how many drivers are on the track, maybe 100, maybe 150, or maybe even 200. And you have to, and by taking part in such a huge event, every day you'll feel that the surface, with every run, the surface will change, and you'll have to adapt. So there are chassis that you'll have to adjust almost every run to keep up with the changing conditions. And you'll be changing axles, changing the track width, adjusting the ride height above the asphalt. You'll be doing a ton of work, changing wheels, and other things, caster, toe, camber, and nothing will help. No speed, nothing works, and so on, right? But some chassis manufacturers and teams, they don't do anything during this time. They just drive and adapt to the new conditions. Well, they might change the tire pressure, maybe adjust the gear ratio. They discuss how to drive, look at the telemetry, and they have way fewer headaches. That's what we're talking about, right? So when we study a particular chassis, we understand how suitable it is for your conditions and how much you'll have to struggle later, constantly having to adjust something for every run, and you just won't be able to find the right setup anywhere. An experienced driver, a really top-level driver, say, someone from the World Championship, from the top 10, can adapt their driving and piloting style to almost any car. They'll set it up themselves, they'll adapt it to the conditions, the surface, the tires, and they'll drive really fast, of course, right? But under certain conditions, they can go even faster if they're driving the chassis they know, love, and have been progressing with. That's the one they're a champion with, right? And they're used to it, something like that. But with some other chassis, it will be harder for them. They'll still be fast, but it'll probably cost them a bit more effort, right? And right here, at this very moment, when you've made all your decisions, figured everything out, and discussed what needs to be done with this chassis, you've talked over the theory, the practical side, discussed the spare parts, right? So you end up with this huge pile of, parts. It's always better to make some kind of table, take notes, write things down. Well, for those who like to analyze things. And then the same question comes up again, the one I mentioned to you at the very beginning, whether to go with used or new. The thing is, even after you've settled on a chassis, say you've chosen one for yourself, let's say, as I mentioned today, SOTI, CRG, CRG. It could be Energy, it could be OTK, one of the OTK models. You make your choice. Yeah, let's say I go with OTK, for example, or I pick Energy. But with Energy, there are chassis that are 10 years old, and there are ones that are 2 years old, and those are both used. And there are also brand new chassis, right? A used chassis that's 2 years old and one that's 10 years old are a bit different. Why? Because there's, well, let's say, take CRG for example. I already mentioned it today, so let's stick with that. 10 years ago, they were really fast. But things changed. The conditions, the tires, the speeds, the engines. And at some point, they started to fall behind, lagging behind their competitors, right? During that period, those chassis were being produced. If you buy that chassis, it will be different from what it was 10 years ago, and it'll also be different from what it was yesterday or the day before. And that goes for used ones, and for all of them, really. Here, of course, you really need to know about this evolutionary aspect, how much everything has changed. If you don't have that kind of historical information, and your friends or colleagues, or whoever's guiding or looking out for you, haven't told you about it or don't know themselves, then you'll basically have to trust the people selling it. But this aspect is really important. Which generation of used chassis are you getting? That's the key point here. How much of a rough journey has that used chassis been through? There are used chassis that are 10 years old, but they only raced once a year. We're just sitting somewhere, basically gathering dust, and their condition is, well, practically perfect. And then there are chassis that have been absolutely thrashed all year long. And those kinds of chassis, after just one season, or two, if it's been in really aggressive conditions, will simply no longer be suitable for driving fast. And yes, I'll say it, a new chassis is always faster than an old one. Always. The brakes work better. All the components and assemblies, the bearings, they all work better. The bearings spin better, and the front end holds its geometry better. There are bearings there too, and there's also toe and camber adjustment. There's no play or vibrations anywhere that get transferred and gradually slow the car down. The elasticity of the tube itself, the frame, the so-called metal part, it's like new. It absorbs all the bumps and holds everything together, meaning it maintains both the geometry and responds to irregularities as it should. There's no so-called metal fatigue, and especially no cracks or anything like that, and even more so if it's ever been in an accident and then bent back. So the metal, it kind of always wants to return to its original state. That's why, in this regard, yes, a new chassis will, of course, always be better. Definitely. Yeah. Used, well, if you don't have enough money, of course, it's better. Or, for example, you might think, I'm not at that level yet, I still need to practice. Why do I need a new chassis? Yeah, but no one knows how quickly they'll progress. No one knows how confidently they'll be able to ride right away. Let's put it that way, right? Yeah, and here, of course, it all depends on your wallet, on what you can afford. No one can force anyone to do anything. Yeah, but if you feel confident in your abilities, if you know you can handle it, of course, you can go for it. And by the way, yes, it also depends on the conditions you're riding in. If you're going to major championships, taking part in heats, competing in the main events, yeah, you'll be right in the thick of it, like in the first races, and even in the middle or at the back of the pack, where, as they say, it's the roughest, especially in the KZ class. You'll be in all that, and yeah, the chassis will wear out quickly, most likely, because of all the contact, hits, people pushing you out, you flying off, attacking the curbs. That's pretty much how it's going to go. Well, but you'll progress faster, and then, once you get a new one, maybe just by replacing a single part, the frame, you'll become a step faster, right? If you're racing in a championship with 5 or 6 races a year, I don't know, maybe 2 or 3 test sessions a month. Well, 1 or 2 test sessions, alone, with no one else around. In these conditions, a new chassis also works great. It won't be subjected to any, maybe in this case it's even preferable because it doesn't experience anywhere, any aggressive impact, and you just drive calmly. But if you don't believe, if you don't feel confident in yourself, or you want to save money, then go ahead and get a used one. Practice. You'll get a ton of unforgettable experiences. You'll improve, and you'll move up a level. So what then? Then you'll get a new chassis. In any case, you'll end up buying a new or at least a newer chassis if you want to compete for the top spots in your championship. And of course, when you figure out which chassis you're getting, you'll also need to decide, depending on which class you're racing in, what kind of water system you'll use. For example, new line or EM, which makes really good radiators right now. Water means radiators, everything related to cooling. Which pump you'll choose, is it chain-driven, belt-driven, right? What are your preferences? Consult with people. What telemetry are you taking there? AI, Melfano, Unipro. Well, in general, and some kind of spare zip should always be taken too. The steering rods, which often bend with any impact, the front wheel, for example, can bend. The steering column, as a rule, follows right after it and bends as well. The steering knuckles can also bend less often, but they do bend. You definitely need to have 2 or 3 axles at least, so you can adjust for differences in stiffness and find the right setup. And just in case you bend one, any jump, impact, or bump will most likely cause some bending, especially if you're running on soft ones. If you can't straighten it, then you'll have to replace it. That's it. And you should have a little kit, chains, sprockets, and so on, and so on. But that's a different story. That's it. Overall, as for the chassis, I tried to cover it for you in as much detail as possible. Don't hold it against me if I went on too long or said too much. Honestly, I feel like I still haven't told you a whole lot. And really, for each aspect, you could talk for a long time just about the wheels. What kind of wheels, right? How do they behave? What do they do? Do they dissipate heat or not? Do they hold up their width? And so on, right? There's a lot you can say about brakes too. Again, I just touched on that briefly. When you're fighting with weight, there are so many components you can look at. I didn't even mention, a lot of people don't even stick on the design decals, those stickers on the outside, because that's also like 700 or 800 grams, right? Extra weight, right? They don't even fill the gas tank all the way. Yeah, I could talk about axles. That's a whole separate story, right? How they work, why this part. The knee, the section that remains, bends or doesn't bend, right? How it works on the track, why it's stiffer or softer, how the caster works, right? So basically, you need to study, know, and understand all these areas. If you want to become a fast driver, you need to understand engineering too. Ideally, let's put it that way, right? Yeah, and at the very least, you should know about tire pressure and gear ratios. So, I've covered these basic things for you. If you still have questions, don't hesitate to write. Now is the perfect time to subscribe. Hit that subscribe button, the bell, and so on. Yeah, so by clicking the subscribe button, you're just letting us know that you're interested. Because a lot of people later call or write and say, hey, what about this, or that, or how does this work? Yes, we explain and talk about it. But we'll try to make sure that as much information as possible is shared right here on YouTube. And if you're interested in hearing more, I'll be happy to keep talking about it. Yeah, so you kind of need to steer things in a direction that interests you, so the conversation develops that way. Well, that's probably all for today. See you, everyone. This was Max Mermanov from SRC Motors. Until next time.